Hey there! Welcome back to the Story Box. I'm R.K. Livingston, and today I'm going to be reading chapters 13 to 15 of Elijah's Boy. And when we left off last time, Nathaniel had gone into the city on a mission for Elijah to discover whether there are any signs of repentance among the people. And as soon as he arrives, he's recognized, and after a short chase, he's captured, and he's been taken to the palace and handed over to Obadiah, who is King Ahab's chief steward. And Obadiah is delivering him to the throne room for an audience with the king. Nathaniel is terrified that they are going to try to force him to tell where Elijah's hiding, and he's determined that he is not going to do that. And so let's find out what happens. When we left off, they were just outside the doors to the throne room. Chapter 13. Obadiah placed a hand on his shoulder and spoke. "I will come forward with you to present you to the king," he instructed. "You must kneel until he gives you leave to rise. Remember, he respects courage." Nathaniel nodded his understanding and followed the steward into the audience chamber of the king of Israel. As soon as the doors closed behind them, Obadiah leaned closer and spoke into the boy's ear. "Yahweh has not forgotten you," he whispered. Nathaniel looked up at him in surprise, but his expression was impossible to read as they walked down the length of the room between carved pillars that rose on either side to support the ornate ceiling high above them. Their footsteps echoed in the vast open space. The room was empty except for the raised dais that they were approaching. Nathaniel could not tear his eyes from the woman who sat on a throne just a little lower than that of her husband. Queen Jezebel was every bit as beautiful as he had heard. Lovely green eyes shone like jewels in the perfect oval of her face, while her hair fell in glossy auburn waves down to her slender waist. Of course, the effect was somewhat spoiled by the sight of the man who stared down at him from his place near her. Balak, with his hooded eyes and mocking expression, did not bother to hide his contempt as he stood close behind the queen's throne. King Ahab sat on the highest throne, watching Nathaniel with calculating eyes as the boy knelt in response to a touch from Obadiah. The old steward bowed. "I present Nathaniel, servant of the prophet Elijah, to you, my lord." "You may stand, servant of the prophet Elijah," said the king. "You are still his servant, I presume?" "I am, my lord," said Nathaniel as he rose to his feet. He was pleased to note that his voice was steady. "Where is your master, then?" shouted King Ahab, pounding his fist on the jeweled arm of his throne. The queen reached out and laid a restraining hand on the arm of her husband. Nathaniel remembered Obadiah's advice and stood without flinching. "You commanded that he leave Samaria. He has obeyed you, my lord." "Oh, he only obeys me when it suits his purpose," muttered the king. He cocked his head to one side and stared at the boy with a speculative gleam in his eyes. Nathaniel felt his mouth go dry, but he forced himself to stare back. Suddenly the king let out a hearty laugh and slapped his thigh. "By all the gods, Jezebel, he is a bold one." Nathaniel stole a glance at the queen and felt his act begin to crumble at the edges. She watched him with her green eyes narrowed to slits, and he had a sudden picture of a cat playing with a mouse before destroying it. Balak was smiling. "She's just like Balak," he thought. On the inside, they're the same. He looked back at the king, but he couldn't shake the feeling of horror that had come over him. The cloying scent of burning incense was making his head spin. He tried to focus his attention on what the king was saying. "It is my wish that you deliver a message to your master." If only he had a chair to sit down on. "Elijah has claimed responsibility for this cursed drought. You heard him yourself." What was he getting at? "He must return to Samaria. Tell him he must withdraw the curse on the land. If he'll present himself to me here, I will do as he asks. All will be forgiven and Israel will be saved." Nathaniel darted a glance at Balak. He was no longer smiling. Could this be what Elijah was waiting for? Was King Ahab ready to repent? Go to him, the king urged. This thing must be ended before all is lost. You must convince him. I will do as you ask, my lord, Nathaniel murmured, bowing his head. Obadiah, the king shouted. See that the boy is escorted from the palace without delay. The steward was at his elbow in an instant. Together they bowed before the king and queen and backed away from the dais. Nathaniel could feel their eyes on him right up until the moment the great doors closed behind him. He could not suppress a great shudder of relief when he found himself outside once again. Obadiah dismissed the soldiers who were waiting at the door and indicated that Nathaniel was to follow him. I've ordered a packet of food made up for your journey, he said. Thank you, Nathaniel said. The steward was beginning to seem almost like a friend. He could sense no threat in the man. Should he trust his instincts? He hesitated, but then decided to speak. You've been kind to me, sir. I didn't expect it, and I can't help wondering why. The old man looked down at the boy and then did a quick survey of the passageway. There was no one near enough to hear them. He began to speak in low tones, keeping his eyes straight ahead. I must talk to you, but you must not appear to be listening. Nathaniel took his cue from the steward. He looked at the floor in front of him and kept walking. What is it? He whispered. I'm in a difficult position, Obadiah said softly. I am King Ahab's chief steward, as I was his father's before him. I am also a follower of Yahweh. Nathaniel sucked in his breath. You will, of course, realize that I am not free to admit my allegiance in public. The queen doesn't like me, he added, glancing around once more. She would like nothing better than an excuse to denounce me. But the king has said he's ready to return to Yahweh. It's a trap. Balak and the queen have convinced King Ahab that Elijah must be destroyed to appease Baal. She plans to have him executed before all the people in the temple square as a warning to others that Baal must not be defied. What should I do? You must warn Elijah to flee, or they will search him out. They'll have you followed when you leave the palace. You'll have to elude them. The city gate will be watched, but I'll do what I can to help you. They stopped for a moment as a servant emerged from a side passage and approached them. He was carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle, which he passed to the steward before turning back the way he had come. This is the food I spoke to you about, Obadiah said, handing the packet to the boy. You'll find a change of clothes as well. It might be of some use. Nathaniel was already thinking of the task ahead of him. He felt certain he could elude anyone trying to follow him once he was back on the streets. The clothes would help. He smiled his thanks to the man who had become his unexpected ally. If you can manage it without being detected, make your way to the inn in the Street of the Potters. Do you know it? Nathaniel gave a slight nod. There you'll find a wagon about to depart for Megiddo. It is to be delivered to the garrison there. The driver will be expecting you. Are you sure the driver can be trusted? Asked Nathaniel, testing the plan in his mind. He's my grandson, Obadiah said. He laid a hand on the boy's shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. He'll see that you get out of the city unobserved. Chapter 14. The stars were out by the time Nathaniel jumped down from the wagon and clasped the driver's hand in gratitude. No word was spoken as he watched the young man disappear in the darkness. He looked back at the distant campfires on the hillside surrounding the city. He had not been recognized at the gate, and he wasn't surprised. He looked like a desert dweller in the clothes Obadiah had given him. Only his eyes showed above the folds of cloth draped across his face and tucked into his turban. He chuckled. Goodbye, Samaria, he whispered. I hope I never see you again. Obadiah was right. He had been followed from the moment he passed out of the palace gate. It didn't take long to discover that nothing is more conspicuous than a soldier trying to appear like an ordinary citizen. Nathaniel had no trouble spotting them even without their uniforms. He stretched the kinks out of his muscles and adjusted his heavy pack. Freedom had never tasted so good. He turned his back on the city and headed up the track into the wilderness. It was a long hike, and his legs began to feel like they were made of stone. He was hungry, too. He cursed himself for not eating anything at the palace when he'd had the chance. He dared not stop, though. Elijah had to be warned. Oh, he'll probably refuse to leave, Nathaniel muttered under his breath. He was just coming to the point where he must leave the track when a huge figure rose up from the rocks to block his path. He fell back with a strangled cry and turned to run. Nathaniel! He stumbled to a halt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Elijah? The big man stepped forward to clasp him in his arms. Thanks be to God, you're safe! Nathaniel was flustered by this unexpected welcome. It felt good. He tried to hide his confusion as the prophet stepped back to survey the loose-fitting clothing the boy wore. You could pass for a Bedouin in the dark, he observed. I had a little trouble, Nathaniel admitted. But what are you doing here in the road? Elijah regarded him, his expression grave. I was waiting for you. We're leaving. Tonight. Now, if you're able. He indicated a small pile of their belongings behind him. It was all packed and ready to go. How did you know? Yahweh has warned me in a dream. We must go and go quickly. Nathaniel had trouble finding his voice for a moment. His first words came out in a croak. I have to tell you what happened. Elijah stood in silence as the boy related his adventures. He stiffened at the mention of King Ahab's treachery. Nathaniel told him all that Obadiah had done for him and finished with his escape from the city in the wagon driven by the steward's grandson Joash. I came to warn you that we must flee, and I find that you're warned already, he said, unable to hide his amazement. Elijah was no longer listening. Obadiah, he mused. Remember his name, Nathaniel. It means servant of Yahweh. God is preserving him for some great purpose in these dark days. As far as Nathaniel was concerned, Obadiah had already performed a great service. What could Elijah be talking about? He was too tired to puzzle it out. He was wondering how much further he could walk when he felt the pack lifted from his shoulder. Come, you'd better rest. Sleep if you can, and I'll wake you when it's time to leave. It would be best to travel in the darkness, I think. Where are we going? Nathaniel asked, his mouth stretching in a huge yawn. To Zarephath. It's a village near Sidon, in Phoenicia. Nathaniel's mouth closed with a snap. Phoenicia? It was madness. Or was it? After all, what better place to hide from Queen Jezebel than in her father, the king of Sidon's backyard? There was a strange sort of justice in the idea. It was perfect, he decided, as he stretched out on the hard ground and closed his eyes. Later that night, he found himself wishing he had known Elijah's plans earlier. They would be following the exact route that Joash had taken on his way to Megiddo with the wagon. As it was, they headed north on foot, stopping only when the gray light of early dawn stole across the eastern sky. They soon found that the hill route from Samaria to Megiddo was rough and difficult. The largest stones had been removed and the deepest holes filled to allow passage of wagons, but it would make for a bumpy and unpleasant ride. After the first night, Nathaniel no longer envied Joash. It was better to walk than to bounce along on the hard seat of a wagon hour after hour. They came to the fortress city on the third night of their journey. Its massive walls seemed to glow in the moonlight, and Nathaniel felt exposed as they stood at the crossroads near the gate. Here, the track they had been following joined a much-traveled trade route that Elijah told him led all the way from the mouth of the Nile. At Megiddo it branched off. The prophet pointed to the way that led inland. That way leads to Damascus, he explained. The other road leads to the coast, past Mount Carmel and north through Phoenicia. Nathaniel stirred and readjusted the pack he carried. We'd better keep going, he whispered. Elijah nodded. Our way lies along the coast road now. He set out at a brisk pace with Nathaniel close at his heels. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and it was a lonely sound. It reminded the boy of cooking fires, and that made him think of food. They had allowed themselves only the smallest rations in order to make their meager supplies last as long as possible. His hunger was a constant nagging in his belly. Over the next few nights, they left the rugged hills behind, and the way grew easier. At the same time, they had to take greater care to remain unseen. More than once they had to detour around places where fellow travelers had chosen to camp by the roadside. Nathaniel might have ventured to creep close enough to borrow some food, but one look at Elijah's stern face drove the thought out of his head. He supposed that stealing would be considered just as bad as lying in the prophet's mind. At last a morning came when Elijah gripped the boy's shoulder and stretched out a hand toward the grassy slopes of a mountain with a rounded peak. "It's Mount Carmel," he said. "There was an altar to Yahweh there at one time, with springs of fresh water on the hillside nearby. We can rest tonight, and tomorrow we will leave Israel behind. I don't think we need to travel at night any longer." Nathaniel lifted his head and took a deep breath. "What is that smell?" Elijah smiled. "It's the sea. You'll see it from the mountain." Some hours later, Nathaniel stood with the wind whipping his clothing around his legs as he gazed in awe at the view from the heights. The sea! Never had he dreamed there could be so much water in the world. There seemed to be no end to it. There were gulls swooping and circling above the waves, and he turned to point them out to Elijah. The shout died on his lips when he saw the brooding scowl on the big man's features. They had found the remains of Yahweh's altar. It was broken, and the stones scattered among the tall grass. Not far away there was an altar to Baal, with a small statue of the god set in a niche of the rock. The wooden pole representing the goddess Asherah stood like a sentinel beside it. Elijah had not spoken since they'd come upon the scene. Now he paced like a caged lion, muttering under his breath. His anger seemed to be mounting with every passing minute, and Nathaniel grew uneasy. "Perhaps we should go away from this spot," he suggested. There was no sign he had been heard. Then, to his surprise, Elijah stopped pacing and lifted his face to the heavens. "You have spoken it," he shouted. "Let it be so." Who had spoken what? God? But he hadn't heard anything. Nathaniel felt a shiver run up his spine. The view was forgotten. The sooner they got off this mountain, the better, as far as he was concerned. When Elijah turned and strode off down the slope, he followed with considerable relief. The next morning they were back on the road and traveling north. Elijah was no longer wrapped in a brooding silence, but he did not offer any explanations. Nathaniel decided it would be better to forget the strange scene on the mountain. He wasn't sure he wanted to know anyway. Chapter 15. They traveled the last leg of their journey in the light of day. They were not alone on the road, but they didn't expect anyone to recognize them in Phoenicia. Still, Nathaniel couldn't quite bring himself to believe that they were no longer in danger. He took good care to make camp apart from other travelers, and he gave no names in any of their dealings with the people they met. Elijah seemed content to leave the talking to him. They reached the outskirts of Zarephath on the 10th day. Even here the effects of the drought could be seen. Nathaniel was no farmer, but he knew enough to recognize that the crops they passed were in poor shape. Zarephath looked to be a busy place. Elijah stopped to rest on a bench at the roadside when they were still some distance from the town. Nathaniel was restless, his hunger reminding him that they had eaten the last of their bread 2 days ago. People came and went, but paid no attention to the two strangers. At last he felt the prophet stirring beside him. "Do you see that woman?" Elijah asked. Nathaniel followed the line of his gaze and saw an old woman stooping to gather a few sticks for firewood. She was at a little distance from them, but there could be no mistake. He nodded. "Go to her," Elijah instructed, "and ask her to prepare some food for us." Nathaniel looked from the prophet to the woman. She had straightened and was slowly making her way back to the road. He could see that she was poor. Her clothing was frayed and much mended, and she was so thin that he wondered if the wind might knock her down. He was still hesitating when Elijah gave him a gentle nudge. When he drew near to her, he could see that she was not as old as he'd supposed. Her face was pinched and drawn. She looked worn out, with burdens too heavy to carry. How could he ask her for anything? He looked back at the prophet and bit his lip. Elijah was leaning forward, watching him. He took a deep breath and stepped in front of the woman. "Excuse me," he murmured as he lifted a hand to his forehead in a gesture of respect. She stopped and regarded him in silence, her eyes like great pools of misery. He swallowed once or twice and cleared his throat. Never, even on his worst day, had he ever asked for food from someone like her. "My name is Nathaniel," he managed to say. "My master and I have come a long way to reach Zarephath. He has instructed me to ask you if you would be kind enough to prepare a meal for us." "I cannot help you," she said, her voice little more than a whisper. "I am only a poor widow with a son to care for. I have enough flour and oil to prepare one last meal for the boy. After that, we die." Nathaniel was horrified. What could he say? I'm sorry," he stammered. He was about to back away when he realized that Elijah had risen and approached. "Don't be afraid," he said to the woman, his voice full of quiet authority. "God will provide." She searched his face with a puzzled frown. "Who are you?" "I am Elijah, prophet of Yahweh," he said simply. "Will you prepare the meal for us?" Nathaniel was shocked, and he felt his face flush with shame. To his astonishment, the woman didn't refuse. Instead, there was a flicker of something like hope in her eyes. "You are Israelites," she said. "I am Milcah. You'll be welcome in my home." Her house was not far. It was set a little distance from its nearest neighbor on the very edge of town. Nathaniel could see that it was made of mud brick like most humble dwellings. If he was right, it would only have one room. An outer stair led to the roof, and he looked up to see that a tent had been set up there to provide a cool place to sleep. He stepped through the door behind the woman. Inside, there was an elevated bench along one wall. It was deep enough to hold sleeping pallets, and on one of these a small boy lay. He tried to sit up, bracing himself on one spindly arm. He was so thin that Nathaniel felt his heart twist with pity. Milcah set her sticks down and bent to kiss him. "My son, Joktan," she explained to the visitors. "Joktan, this is Elijah and his servant Nathaniel. I've promised them a meal." Her voice caught, but she drew herself up and continued. "We will do this one last thing." The child looked from boy to man with eyes far too old for his years. He didn't complain. Instead, his lips curled upward in a weak smile. Nathaniel wanted to run away. "You'll find water to wash in the jug near the door," Milcah said as she set about making her preparations. The hard-packed earth of the yard had been swept clean, and she placed a circular mat on it to serve as a table. "I can build the fire for you," Nathaniel offered. "You're my guest," she objected. "Elijah is the guest, not me," he insisted. "Please, let me help." She looked at him for a moment before nodding in agreement. Elijah sat in silence while she fashioned a flat loaf from the last of her flour and oil. She placed it on a smooth stone in the midst of the hot coals as soon as the fire burned low. It didn't take long to bake. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, wondering what more he could do. He looked in at the child, but Joktan had closed his eyes. Perhaps he was asleep. When Milcah brought the loaf to Elijah, he blessed it and broke it in two, offering half to Nathaniel. The boy shook his head and backed away. "I'm not that hungry," he insisted. He couldn't bear to watch as Elijah ate the loaf that should have been Joktan's. He turned into the small dwelling and tried to sort out his troubled thoughts. He couldn't believe that Elijah could be so callous. Was it because Milcah and her son were not Israelites? His thoughts were churning as he reached for the jar of oil that Milcah had emptied, intending to replace it on the shelf. What? The jar wasn't empty. This couldn't be. He had seen her drain the last drops with his own eyes, and yet here it was, full to the brim with oil. Was he going mad? He scrambled about searching for the empty flour sack, his heart pounding in his chest. There it was, but it was no longer empty. He tore at the mouth of the bag, and a handful of flour drifted onto his trembling fingers. "Elijah!" he shouted, his voice coming out in a harsh croak. "Milcah!" The widow was at the door in an instant, her frightened gaze darting to the mat where Joktan was now sitting up. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she sagged against the door frame at the sight of him. "Look!" cried Nathaniel, sifting the flour through his hands. "It's a miracle!" He ran out to the yard to find Elijah, while Milcah knelt by the sack, rejoicing and giving thanks to God through her tears. "Elijah! The flour! The oil!" he cried, the words getting tangled in his mouth in his excitement. His shrill babbling trailed off into silence, and he stood staring as the slow light of understanding began to dawn in his mind. The big man had not moved from his place, but was sitting calmly and regarding him with one eyebrow lifted. You knew," Nathaniel gasped. "You knew all along." And that is where we're going to leave off. And so I hope you'll join me next time as we find out what happens from here. Be sure to hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed today's episode. Till next time, keep dreaming and God bless.